to hear Darryl.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. So, appreciate you being here, and appreciate Darryl Alexander being here with us to demonstrate some freehand carving and what he does in order to carve gemstones. He's certainly very talented, him and his son. My understanding, your son is currently manning the booth, so he can be here with you. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. So, on that note, I'm going to get the camera started over here, and we'll let Darryl run the show for us. And if you didn't already get a door prize ticket for this round, so if you already got one when you came in before and you stayed, get another one.
No.
No?
No, not for this morning. If you don't have one, we'll give you one after this session.
Perfect. All right, sounds good. Excuse me, Scott. Let me hit my record button on this.
I don't know if they really want a camera that close on his face, so.
Well, the battery will probably die in 10 minutes because they're old, so we'll
Okay,
see.
so we got 10 minutes to make this all work. All right, well, I'll just start off by introducing myself. I'm Darryl Alexander, and I'm a gem cutter jeweler. I started off doing jewelry work, and then I moved into gem cutting later on. My son, Nick, who is a cutter also, works with me, and he's an accomplished cutter. He is one of the youngest cutters, we believe, for Spectrum. He won at 17 years old, so he won a cutting competition at 17. So he's learned a little bit. We've had a little friendly rivalry going on in the studio. So, you know, with that being said, one of the things that I started off teaching Nick to do, and I'm going to use Nick as an example, and you can apply yourself in that principle, is that one of the things that I felt was crucial for him to learn to start doing carving or faceting or any technique you're going to do is to study design first. Because I think, at least as far as I'm concerned, you can have the ability to do a piece, but if you don't have good design, it doesn't make a bit of difference. And what I mean by that is in the sense that if you're working on let's say a stone or a jewelry design, you may have great ideas, but if you don't know how to execute them well, or if the design doesn't flow or move in a manner that evokes an emotion for individuals, then it doesn't speak to people. And I'm a firm believer in your design has to speak to people. It has to move people in some manner to be relevant to them. The whole idea is if you're doing this, you're either doing it for a passion or love of what you do, or you're doing it to make money at it. And if you're doing it for a passion and a love, that's one thing, and that's great. And you can express yourself however you want to express yourself. And I still believe that even if you're looking to sell it, you still have to have your own voice. But I also think it's very important to consider the end user, the individual that you're trying to present it to, whether it's just for your own work or whether you're trying to present it to a public. If you're trying to present it to a public, you got to think, how's it going to be set if you're cutting a stone? And that's what we're addressing today. How's it going to be set? Is this design something that appeals to people? Is it a design that is functional in some manner? And is this a design that you feel like is marketable? That's kind of the end thing to me. Marketability to me is the last aspect you should consider as far as I'm concerned. Now, that's just my opinion. And I say that in the sense that if you love a product, if you love a design, most of the time, if you believe in what you're doing, you can sell somebody on it. But you can't sell something that's not attractive. So that's why I say design's crucial. So I spent a lot of time telling Nick, study nature, study architecture, study other artists' work. Now, when I say study other artists' work, I don't mean copy their work. I do mean look at how they approached it. What was their approach? What was their idea? What was their feeling on it? For me, everything, I'm inspired by nature. So when I sit down and I design, that's what I draw my inspiration from. And people love nature. And very little for me in nature is rigid or structured in the sense that it's sharp edges and hard. Most of nature is fluid. Okay? And so that's just my take on it. I know other artists who like that very structured hard edge design, and that's the direction they go, and that's great. But you got to find your voice in it. So with that being said, when you sit down to design a stone, we all know that there are traditional cuts. You have your pear shape, which is what this is here, okay? We have an oval, which I'll show you, and I'm just doing this because maybe they're novice who aren't quite familiar with the shapes and terms. So this is an oval shape, right? Okay. You have a marquee, which is shaped like a football. I don't have one on hand. And you have an emerald cut. Okay. And then there's the trillion cut, which is a triangle shape. So you have a few different basic shapes that you can work within, starting off. Those are, and obviously your standard round brilliant. So those are your basic shapes that you kind of start off with. When you're doing carving in relationship to faceting, if you're a faceter, you already have those basic skills down. So what we were addressing today is the combination of faceting and carving in combination. And when you look at it from that aspect, you have to go, what am I trying to achieve by doing that? Well, in my opinion, you're trying to enhance the beauty of the cut, or add a character to the cut, or create a different look for a cut that you don't traditionally have by doing your standard faceting. There are a lot of techniques that you can use for faceting to create new looks and new shapes, but the idea of carving or introducing negative cuts to a stone, which is what I've done here. I don't know if you guys can see that very well, but there are V shapes in the back of the stone. And it doesn't have to be a V shape. It could be a bubble, or what they call a dimple. And that is made by a wheel that is rounded, a ball burr. It's just same as you would use in jewelry, it's just diamond coated. Okay? When it comes to creating the V shape, you have just that, a V-shaped wheel. And that V-shaped wheel is what you use to introduce your negative cut in the back of the stone or on the table of the stone, depending on what you're trying to do. This is the V-shaped wheel. Okay?
And is that diamond coated as well?
They're all diamond coated. These are diamond coated wheels.
So is that plated or sintered?
These are plated. You can use plated or centered. It doesn't make a difference. When I started out, I started with plated wheels because they were inexpensive. I didn't have to worry about the cost of centered wheels. Because, give you an example, a plated wheel could probably run you $15. That same wheel in centered would probably $50 or $60 if it's a big wheel. The prices vary, but plated are inexpensive. They don't last long. The difference with plated is that as you wear or use that wheel, it retains its shape. Centered wheels, as you use that wheel, will start to lose its shape. So you have to redress that wheel to maintain that shape. Or as you use it, then transfer it to another use. Meaning that now that the point's no longer sharp, we're going to now start to round that end off, and maybe we use it now for carving as opposed to inlaying V shapes, right? So you're still using that wheel's still usable, just in a different purpose from what you initially wanted, because you're not getting a crisp, clean, sharp edge. Where plated will retain its edge until it wears out, and then it's disposable. And that's kind of the thing with plated wheels. They are disposable, but they're great to start out with. Now, I will say I use both. I use both because I feel like each has its purpose. I use plated wheels to just tear up, so to speak. I use them with little concern, meaning that if I wear the edge out, I don't care. If I have an expensive centered wheel, I care. So you're not going to just go at an agate, for instance, and carve a V shape with the centered wheel, because if you do that, you're going to quickly lose your edge, and they're very difficult to redress and maintain that shape. Whereas if I do that with a plated wheel, I don't care, right? We can go in, we can cut our groove, we can get our depth that we want. Then I go back in detail with my centered wheel. And the reason for that is because that centered wheel generally cuts cleaner than a plated wheel.
When you redress your centered wheel, how do you make sure, if you start with an angle like this, and now you get a rounded edge, how do you get back to that original angle?
It's very, very difficult. So you want to make sure you're redressing your wheel constantly to maintain that edge. Because if you let it go too far, it's very difficult to get it back. So
Do you dress with an aluminum oxide stick, or what do you dress with?
yes, you can address with the aluminum oxide stick, and generally that's what I do. Is I'll take, let's say it's a 600, I take a coarser diamond wheel, whether it's plated that I lost the edge of, and use it to redress, or I use a carborundum type wheel to redress, preferably carborundum, but I cheat sometimes. But you generally will have to, as you mentioned, trying to maintain that angle, whether you have a good eye or you just kind of have tried to keep that edge as it should be. You want to then just, you're basically resharpening your leading edge. You don't have to redress the whole angle. So as long as you're maintaining that edge, that leading point edge, you generally don't have to worry about trying to refigure your pitch back out. For me, that's not as critical because as I'm carving, I'm not so worried about necessarily the angle all the time. Usually it's just I'm looking to get a particular look for that negative cut that I'm cutting. Okay, so that's the idea that you have. Now this is, I'll show you the difference between plated and centered. They look very similar, but the costs are, as I mentioned, are nowhere near the same. So you can have, these are centered. Centered means that the diamond goes all the way through the material. Plated is just that. It's just a plating on the surface. Diamond's bonded usually by some type of nickel or some other kind of compound that is adhering the diamond to the surface. And it's just plated on. So they wear out fairly quickly. Okay, so now that we've addressed that aspect of it, there are several tools that you're going to need to have if you're going to do carving or faceting. And I'm going to start out with safety first because that's, to me, the ultimate thing. I don't care what you do, safety is ultimate. You need to be having safety glasses. You need to make sure that you're wearing a mask, one that is in particular for particulates. So you want to make sure that it's good for removing all types of dust, things like that. The other thing is making sure if you have long hair, that you tie your hair back, things like that. You don't want to get caught in the wheel. Safety is always your first and first thought of doing cutting. Okay, so once you got your safety protocols in place, then the next thing you're going to do is determine what am I wanting to do with this. Okay, so if you carved a gem, for instance, or faceted a gemstone, and you're looking at this going, okay, what do I want? I never suggest to people to just go at it. Thought it out. Think about it. Whether you're taking a pen and paper and drawing out your design, or you're taking a Sharpie and you're drawing your design on the stone, laying it out. I draw on the stone. So I take a Sharpie, black Sharpie, and I lay my cuts, or what will be my potential cuts, in place with a Sharpie. That way I can turn the stone over and I can look at it through the table and go, do I like this or do I not like this? Okay. So if you have started your faceting, I preform my stones first, meaning I grind a basic shape. So let's say I'm doing an emerald cut like this particular stone. I will preform this shape. I will polish just the table just so I can at least get a window into the stone. And then as you get ready to start your faceting, I will lay in from that table my marks on the back so I can see through the table how that stone should look once I start doing my negative cutting with whether my ball burr or whether my V-shaped wheel or whether you're doing a reverse intaglio. Okay? The reason for that is you want to start out prior to that is you kind of want to know exactly what you're doing. Once you get your stone faceted, obviously it's going to be difficult because it's dopped up to see what you're going to be doing. So that's the reason for that. Once it's dopped and it's set on your dop stick like we have here, it's much harder to determine what you're going to be doing. So that's the reason for looking at it first off. Then I lay my V shapes in once I got my basic shape faceted. So we start out with the culet first if you're doing your negative cuts on the back side. The reason for that is because you want to lay all your facets in place, get to about a 600 grit finish. Then I lay in my final details for my facet. I either deepen those details with my negative cuts, or if you got really fine cutting tools, which if you're going to do, let's say you go to a 600, you're going to use a 400 grit, whether it's centered or plated, to lay in your detail, because it doesn't chip too bad. Anything coarser than that's going to chip. So then that means you need to back up further before you get to that grit, because you can't have chipping around the edges. And so as you facet, you remove that. So you want to use about a 400 grit. You go in and you lay in your V shapes or your ball burr, and then you finish with your next grit to a polish. Because as you put your loop on and you look at that, you'll see micro chips around that negative cut that you laid in.
What's your normal cutting sequence for grits?
I will use a little bit coarser wheel, so 400's what I do my detailing with. I will start out with a little bit coarser. We sell and companies sell these particular tools. So I have a company called Cutting Edge Tool Supply, which sells jewelry tools, lapidary tools, and equipment to the industry. So we have a 600, which is very, very few people sell the 600 anymore because it loses its edge so quickly, unless it's a centered wheel. We will have a 220, a 110, I think is what the other is, and the 400. The 400 is what I use the most of.
So let's say you start at 400.
Yeah, when I'm fastening, I just go to the 400. I don't generally go anything coarser unless I'm working in something that I'm really concerned with. And the reason for that is because, like I said, the 400 grit just doesn't chip very bad. Where some of the others will chip so much around your edging that you then got to go back and almost refacet the culet of your stone.
And then what are your successive grits after 400?
So after you lay your grits in, that is the catch here. The fun begins. It's easy to rough this in. It's very difficult to finish. So I like using a couple of different things. You can use wood. You can use, so when I say wood, to clean up your details. So let's say I used a ball burr and I created a dimple or a depression in the back of the stone. You then have to go in and polish that in order for that to look nice. So you've got to create a burr, because unfortunately they don't sell them. You got to create a burr that's the exact diameter of that ball burr that you use to create the depression. So there's 3 different things you can use. One is you can use wood. You want a wood that doesn't have a grain structure. So you want something that's a hardwood that doesn't have a strong grain. You can use oak, but oak tends to have a soft and hard end. I like maple, or they also use, a lot of guys use phenolic.
I use mesquite.
Yeah, mesquite works well. I know guys who use ebony. I know there's a variety of woods. You're just looking for a tight grain wood. Doesn't matter what you use, basically, as long as it doesn't have a soft and hard texture to it.
Does walnut have too much grain?
No, walnut works great too.
That looks good.
Yeah. I like bamboo. So I often, whenever I go to have dinner, I grab bamboo skewers and chopsticks. So, and I cut those up and I use those for my woodwork, or for my ball burrs, and for detailing. Bamboo works great because it picks up and holds the grit well, because it's just porous enough that it tends to take it well, and it doesn't wear out really quickly. The others work the same. So phenolic will work, wood will work, bamboo will work. You can also use a hard felt. So if you're doing felt, you can buy generally felt bobs. So we do sell felt bobs in different shapes, different sizes that will do that for you as well. Now, once you get to that 400 grit, you cut your lines in. you can go back in and use the wood, and you use successive grits. So you're going to go from a 600 to a 1200 to maybe something like a 2000, and then up. So I usually use 4 grits. So we have available, and there's a couple companies that carry these grits, or paste, and you can, whether you use it in a syringe form or whether you use it in a paste form. I don't think I have a paste little container with me, but it just comes in a little container that's got a lid, and it's just almost like a wax. And you just run your burr in it, pick it up, and do your finishing. So I like to use the paste, personally, not paste, but the syringe type grits personally. I think they work well for being to apply just a little bit very easily, and then you just can keep going into that same depression till you get a polish with different grits. Now the key is not contaminating your grits. Don't cross-contaminate your grits. So if you start out with 600, you make a container of all your 600 burrs. You make a container of all your 1200 burrs, and so on. Okay? So you've got to make these tools, and you've got to make several of them. The reason for that is because once you cross-contaminate going to your finer grit, you can never get a great finish, because it's just, you're going to always wind up with scratches. So you want to make sure you're doing a good cleaning job of your stone and your hands and your surroundings as you move to your next grits. If you don't, you'll struggle trying to get a finish and going, why is this scratching? It didn't have scratches before, now it's picking up scratches. It's the same with faceting, correct? If you're not clean, you're going to have problems. So you've got to keep your work surfaces clean, cleaning your hands between your grits, and in that sense, you'll do well. I think it's a little more critical, even cleaning your hands between your grits with carving than faceting. Faceting, you may use one hand to do it, and you're faceting with the other. You can pick up, you wipe your hands off, you rinse your hand off with something, and then you go to your next. People don't think too much about it, but when you're carving, it's very critical, because you're using a lot of paste. Yes?
So for your wood balls, are you using a lathe to make that, or what's your technique?
So what I'm doing basically, I go to a table saw and I just cut blocks, probably 1/4 inch, little strips of wood, and sometimes thicker than that, just depending on how thick you need to make your piece. And then I just take a compass, I'll draw a circle, I take my jeweler saw, I cut that circle out. Because you've used a compass, you know where your center is. Then I take another drill and I drill a hole in the center. And I like to save a lot of my old burrs from jewelers. If you're a jeweler or you're not a jeweler, ask the jeweler to start saving his bristle brushes. Because when they wear out, you've got a perfect shaft that's centered, you don't have to worry about it, and all you do is cut the top off. So this is your polishing brush, right? Bristle brush. You got a perfect end for using to now mount your burrs, your wood to, or your felt to. So I just cut the top off with the jeweler's saw, or separating disc. Yeah, and I just glue it into the wood. And 2-part epoxy. You can even use super glue if you get a good tight fit, but I prefer 2-part epoxy. It seems to hold a little better.
And then to get the ball the right size, what's your technique?
So then at that point, once that's done, I chuck it up in my handpiece, and I lock this up in a C-clamp or a vise of some sort, and I take a file to it. Just take a file and shape it. Very simple. Same with if you want to point, or you want to create a V shape, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to file back. So if you've got a block of wood like this and you want to create a V shape, I file back to this area, recessed it, so I've got a raised area out here, and then I file my V's. Or you could take a jeweler's graver, and if you've got a lathe setup, and create it. Very simple. Don't complicate it.
So when you talk about the same size, how accurate are you trying to be? Because my mind is saying, I want to get it perfect, and I don't know how to measure
No,
it.
you don't need perfect. You just need good close.
Okay.
Because it's going to change as you use it anyway. Your shape's going to start to wear anyway. So you're going to have to redress those ball burrs, those phenolic wheels, those felt wheels, whatever it is. You're going to have to redress them or repurpose them
And if it's a
anyway.
little bit bigger than your feature, it will kind of reduce in size to fit very quickly.
Yeah, and if you start out large, the problem you have, I always go just personally a hair smaller. And the reason why is because if you go a little bit larger and you got a V shape that you're wanting to maintain that shape, for instance, and you go in with a wood that's a little bit larger, it's going to widen it. It will cut. So you want to be cognizant of that idea. So if you do go larger, you got to realize that it's gonna widen your shape a little bit. So if you come just either the exact same size or a little bit smaller, when you go into it, you may have to move it a little bit, but you don't have to do much, and that'll clean up that inside edge without distorting the outer edge, if that makes sense to you.
It does.
Okay, same with your ball burr. Okay, for V-shaped wheels, so when I do my carving, like this particular one that I've cut these negative V's into, okay, I like these rubberized diamond wheels. They work great, and they come in different grits, as you can see here, from polished to coarse, and you can go through the full successive grit to do your V-shaped wheels. Now, are they the shape of the V that you cut? No. But when you use your Optivisor, you can look and you can see your line of where you're laying your face at, and you'll see it polished or cut away.
Could
and
I
you
see
just
that
work
too,
it.
Scott?
Yeah, you can pass these around.
Yeah.
How
That'd be
do you keep, okay, so you're cutting your V,
Mm-hmm.
and your hand holding it. How do you keep the edges of your V flat?
Practice.
Damn!
Practice, you
I'm a
know.
dead man.
Well, one of the things that helps is, like I mentioned, if you've got, if you make your wheels the shape of the wheel that they cut, you generally don't have to worry much about trying to maintain that.
In my case, you would be wrong.
The rubber wheels are nice in that they're narrow and they're sharp, and so you can by eye go in and watch what you're doing as you work it,
So you're basically working one face of the V with your rubber wheel.
and then
at
work
a
the
time.
second face of them. Yes, and then when you're through doing that, you've gone through your successive grits. You want to then go in with a polish. So you're going to either use a 600 grit to polish out that, and then go through your successive grits till you get a polish, or you're going to use the rubber wheels to get close to a polish, and then use a final bristle brush and that V to get for a final polish. Correct.
So I've got a similar question along the lines of Scott. So I've purchased some things from your shop, and I will say it's a great shop. I'll throw that out there. So I've purchased some things and have been toying around with some agates and just kind of getting a feel for things. One of the challenges I had is as I'm using the Fordham, and I'm just holding a piece, or I have a plastic vise, and if I'm using a ball burr, how do I keep it from bouncing and keep it steady?
Okay.
That's extremely difficult.
Yes. Okay. So as you can see, one of the things I've done is I've mounted this stone. So let's say you got your stone pretty well. You got your table done. We're working on the bottom of the stone. You cut your V's in it. It's best if it's mounted to something, because you've got control. It's very hard to hold a stone this size or smaller and control your detail. So it's easiest if you mount this, whether it's to a wooden dowel, whether it's to a faceting rod, whatever you're going to do, because two ways of doing it, whether you hold it in your hand, and this is the technique I've taught my son, and I will show you here. It's a technique of bracing for one thing. So this will help you on maintaining your face. And this is just self-taught. So let me back that up and tell you all, I'm self-taught. So all the knowledge I have is just what I've gained by doing this. Okay. So if you're working on this, I lay my thumb against my other hand, and that steadies you. So I can work up here. I can totally work up here and do whatever I'm doing. Now I rest my arms on something, whether it's my jeweler's bench. So that's the other thing too. I don't have any fancy setup. I'm a jeweler. That's how I started. And so for me, that's the way I use my jewelry tools was natural. And so that's how I carve. And I have videos on my Instagram showing how I do that. But I just rest my arms on my jeweler's bench, because that's where I work. So I lay a towel down in my pan, and I drape it up in front of me, and I put a piece of plastic under the towel so that my bench doesn't get wet. I put a bowl in there, and then I just sit there and I work. Now I have a light source above me, just my jeweler's light, and sometimes you need more than that, just depending on what you're doing. I use an optivisor, and quite often I have a vacuum system set up that draws the dust or any particulates away. You don't have to have that. I did for a lot of years didn't have it, but I wore a mask making sure that I was safe. Okay, but if you can set that up, that's best. But bracing your hand. So basically, you're going to hold your piece. You brace your thumb up against your hand, and then that way you've got a lot of control as to your carving. So that's one way you do it. The second way you do it is when you're asking about the ball burr. Ball burrs have a tendency to want to roll. They'll pull out of whatever area you're working. So I'll show you the use for the ball burr. And I use a number 30 handpiece and a quick change 3/32 shank handpiece. I use both because you will get both sizes in your burrs. You'll get the heavy that you need this for, and you'll get the thinner that you can use your 3/32 for. Okay, but obviously all you need is this if you want to use either or. You do not want to start like this.
Okay, that was my problem.
Because if you start this way, what it does is it rolls out, okay? You start from the side. Use your side. So you start from the side, and you work it a little bit, and then as you have worked that, and you got a nice depression, then I never really just come straight in. I always just work it a little bit. I turn the piece, and I work it. Because what happens is when you come straight down, even if you've gotten a nice depression, when you come straight down in it, sometimes, and quite often, this edge chips. Because if you think about it, as that burr rotates, you're creating your chipping going down. When you turn it up, all of a sudden the torque comes out. It's not pushing it down. Your torque is being forced out this way. And so all of that edging wants to chip. It's just a nightmare. So never come straight down. I shouldn't say never, but I don't, okay? If you're comfortable doing that and you can make it work, great for you. But generally speaking, it doesn't work well. And two, the reason I don't ever do that is because when you come straight down, if you slip at all, it's going to roll out and over the face of what you've already worked on. So start from the side and work at, I would say probably maybe max 80-degree angle, and then rotate your stone. Because what happens is, after you work this burr for a while, whether it's centered or plated, it starts to get a little elongated. Instead of staying perfectly round, if you don't work that surface, it gets more like this. Because your sides are what you're using. You don't use the top very little. And so you just want to make sure you're working that whole surface.
If you start your hole at a 600 grit on a fantasy machine, it eventually makes the dimple deep enough that when you now go to your hand piece, your successive grits, you actually have a pit that you're going into, and now you really have a lot of control over your position. Yeah.
Now, when I am using the phenolics, when I go to the wood to polish and stuff, I will stand it up. Because that will not create chipping because it's a fine enough grit. So then you can actually make sure your hole is nice and round. So when you go to your final, you can work it that way.
Okay.
But when you're using your diamond, don't ever stand it straight up. Okay? One of the other things that I do, as I mentioned when I'm carving, I mount this. You can actually mount this in a vise, which is helpful for some people. There are people, now because I'm a jeweler, I take the tool to the stone. That's how I taught myself, because that's the way you work in jewelry. You never take your jewelry to the tool. There are carvers who work just the opposite, and it works just as well. Actually, it works better in the sense that you get less fatigue on your hands, it's less stress on your hands. So you can mount this in some type of vise, and then bring your tool, if this were mounted, see if we can get this to sit here for just a second. If this were mounted, you are going to then take your tool to your stone to the tool, not your tool to the stone, which is what I do. And it's
Like a wheel or a
yes,
grinder.
yes. So it's a fixed setup, and you're working from this way. Okay, whether it's carving, whether it's putting your dimples in, whatever you're doing. Okay, that's really for most people. If you went to Germany or any of the other places, that's how they're taught. We Americans came in behind all of these guys. We're late to the game. They have hundreds of years of experience in carving. And if you're looking for less fatigue on your hands, you're looking for more control, you're going to get more by taking the stone to the tool. It's just, it's just the way we have learned, because we wanted to mimic what they were doing. They weren't going to divulge the information, which understandably they wanted to maintain their skills. And some people were willing to teach, but generally speaking, most people didn't learn it. So they're going, okay, how do I learn this on my own? We didn't have the equipment that they had, so what we had was our jeweler's stuff. So you had people like Henry Hunt and some of these early guys who were pioneers for this that were just incredible in doing that. He even wrote a couple books on carving, wonderful books on carving. That's how I learned, was reading his books and just experimenting. But again, because I'm a jeweler, this made sense to me. This is what I'm used to. So I bring my tool to the stone. Another way, if you're going to do that, is drip systems. If you're going to do a fixed setup, you need to set up a drip system of some sort so that your wheel stays wet. You don't want to run these dry. As you run them dry, you create a lot of dust, you get more chipping. The water is a lubricant. It keeps your stone from overheating, and it also keeps it from chipping as bad. I'm not going to tell you that I don't run these dry sometimes, because I do, because there are certain times where you need to see the detail. But if you do that, you need to have a good system that draws the dust away, because you don't want to be breathing that dust in or putting the dust all in the room. Okay? But that's usually just for detail. One of the other things that I do is when I'm sitting at the bench, because like I said, I start out this way, I just have a simple little plastic water dish that I use. So I fill it with water, and I sit at my jeweler's bench, and this is where I do all of my carving. I wear an apron so I don't get stuff all over me. I put a towel in front of me, and that's how I work. So you don't have to have an elaborate setup to do it.
Do you dip the stone or the...
I do
burr
both. I do both. So as I'm working, I'll dip my stone and I'll do this, and then I'll work. The reason why I dip the stone sometimes is because the grooves tend to hold water longer than your burr tends to hold the water. And so that's the reason why. You don't have to, you could just do, but then you're dipping quite a bit compared to if you're doing both, and working. Or if you're smart, which obviously I'm not, you set up a drip system. And you control your drip. Some guys do that. I'm just kind of old school, I guess, and didn't think it through, but that's just the process I use, and it works.
So back to the rubber wheels. Is that what some people call a cray wheel?
No, these are different. These are these burrs these wheels came from the dental industry, and they're diamond impregnated wheels. Now you can use Craytex wheels, you can use carborundum wheels, but they have to have a certain grit to cut. Otherwise, they just don't do anything.
So cray is a softer grip.
Craytex wheels is a term for a type of wheel, and they have different grits in Craytex wheels and different mediums, whether it's a silicon carbide, whether it's a aluminum oxide, and some of them work, but they just don't last very long. They wear out really rapidly. These last, and these work really well.
What's the substrate then on these that the diamond is impregnated?
I couldn't honestly tell you.
Does it feel like a rubber or more like a...
No, these are hard. Here, I'll give you a couple to kind of check out.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Is it like Ceragloss?
You know what? I'll pass a few of these around. These are all diamond rubber wheels. You guys can just pass these around and check them out.
Now, those flexible Nova discs can still have the same effect, right?
Yes, Nova wheels work well. Okay, so now we can go back to that a little bit. So let's say you've done your carving work with your diamond wheel, right? I use several different wheels. I don't always just use these. There are times that I will use different wheels. So this is a diamond disc that we sell. This is one that I developed that I use. You have Diamond Pacific that sells these pressure pad type wheels that they use for carving in different grits. They work excellent. We sell those as well. I like these particular wheels. These are diamond. They're a plastic almost.
What do you mount them on?
They're a micron diamond bonded to a plastic.
No, but you would
backing.
take this disc and put it on a what?
So I take that disc and so these mandrels that have the screw-on heads.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah. So what I do is I find the center with the compass,
Yeah,
and then I drill my hole in it,
yep.
and then I just mount them to.
Okay, so you're just using it like a floppy disk.
Yes, I'm using it like a floppy disk to clean up your carvings, and you
And
can
where-
see the different
where do you get
grits.
those?
They're on our site also, but these are ones that specifically are designed and developed by my company for carving.
What's a 260 run?
They're sold in packets and they're inexpensive.
Approximately.
I
Don't
hate
worry,
to say it,
we'll
but I
hold
don't
you
know
to the fire.
offhand. I want to say they're probably like $15 for a packet of like 7 or 8. But they last forever.
Yeah,
One of the tricks you'll want to do though is quite often I will mount those to a plastic disc of some sort or a plastic backing to give it more strength.
sure.
And I just use a rubber cement or a something to bond it.
Well, what kind of plastic you found works best? Bottle cap? I like your style, baby.
I save all my tops off of
Yeah.
my water bottles, and I cut that top out. You've got a center. You
Sure.
glue it to this, and it just
And you're
works.
done.
It's just enough that it flexes, but it gives enough strength that it works. Experimenting, just experimenting, but that works great. And the reason why too I like this is because if you nick the side of your stone with the back, it doesn't scratch or chip, where some things will. So they work great. It's just a little trick or tip that I figured out. But and I will mount some that way. Some I don't mount to anything at all. Some I leave. So we have some that have a stick back to them. So just depending what you buy, the ones that have the stick back, you just peel it off, you stick it to whatever you want, and it works. Whether you're mounting it to a valve, which is a V-shaped rubber wheel that's pretty stiff that you can use for flat sanding or mounting it and using it, to come up against, or whether you're doing like what I'm doing, which is drilling a hole in it and mounting it and using like a snap sanding disc.
Do you have one of those attached to a power cap?
I don't think I brought those.
Okay.
No,
Don't worry about it.
I don't have one here. But it's really simple. So what I do is I take a compass, I basically kind of find my center. I put my compass there, and because the compass has, you can buy ones with a point on one side. I use that point, and it just cuts through. Or draw your line, scribe a line, and then just take scissors.
Yeah,
cut it
there's
out.
also a tool called a center finder that you use for finding the center of the dowel. Just lay it on one side, scribe a line, 90 degrees to that, scribe a line, there's your center.
Okay.
Drill.
There you go. So that's the approach I take. So those are other ways of using different grits, and you've got successive grits. This is a 1200. This will leave you. I go to 1200, and from there I go to a polish, because these are fine enough that there's just not. You don't need to do much.
Diamond or oxide for the polish?
Going to the diamond
Usually.
compounds. Yeah, I almost exclusively use diamond compounds. I don't like using the oxides because it just puts so much stuff out. The cleaner I can work and the less mess it creates, the better for me.
So do you go directly from 1,200 to like 50,000 diamond?
Yeah. This particular, and I have to, if you guys want to message me, I can let you know, but this was a diamond paste that I had developed. And this particular diamond paste comes from one specific manufacturer. I use this almost exclusively. And the reason why, this is a 600 grit. This is a 600 grit, but it doesn't work like a 600 grit. It starts out like a 600 grit, but it will leave you a 1200 finish. 600 doesn't do that. 600 will leave you a 600 grit. This cuts and then polishes.
Do you polish at 50K or 14?
It just depends on what I'm working on, to be very honest. You know, and what effect I'm trying to achieve. There are times that I want a soft matte finish left on something, and there are times I want it to be glass polished. So it just depends on what you're trying to do. You know, I will tell you, no matter what you do, work it till it glows if you're trying to get a polish. Because quite often what people do is they will polish and then they think, oh, that's decent, that's a good polish. Work it till it glows. I will tell you, polishing is a technique in itself. People don't realize, they think, oh, if I've gone through the successive grits, I should have that finish. That's not true. I can take a 600 grit, even a standard 600 grit, and if you use it correctly, you can almost get a polish. It won't stay a 600 grit. So what happens is, and this is what I was explaining to my son Nick also when I was teaching him to work. Whenever you're polishing something, now if you're polishing a larger carving, you want to cross hatch, meaning that you don't want to keep polishing the same direction. You see how your hand is? If you polish that way, it's going to deepen